Thank you very much. So, hauntings, poltergeists and ghosts, time for a new terminology. Dr. Peter McCue, thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you don't think this is going to be a pedantic talk about classificatory matters. I think it's important to address the problems with the current nomenclature, because it is a mess, the current nomenclature, as I hope I'll be able to illustrate. Could I have the next slide, please, CJ? You'll probably, all of you will be aware, this traditional distinction with regard to recurrent spontaneous paranormal phenomena, or supposedly paranormal phenomena, into two main categories: hauntings and poltergeist cases. The defining feature of hauntings, perhaps, if there is one, and there's a degree of arbitrariness in the way in which these terms are used, is often that the phenomena seem to be primarily linked with a particular place rather than a particular person. Another feature, which maybe not defining, but is one that's maybe characteristic of some cases that would be described as hauntings, is that the phenomena tend to have a sensory character: hearing sounds, sensing a presence, seeing an apparition, as opposed to something that's very definitely objective and physical. Poltergeist cases, on the other hand, are often thought to be person-linked, linked to someone perhaps on the scene, and to have a decidedly physical character. And this is probably the essential difference. The problem is that in poltergeist cases, cases that are regarded as poltergeist cases, you can also get sensory phenomena. In fact, anything that you can get in a haunting, you can get in a poltergeist case. For instance, apparitions are sometimes reported in poltergeist cases as well as cases regarded as hauntings. So there's a lot of sort of vagueness and overlap here. Next slide, please, CJ. Now, before I go on to relevant studies, which is the topic of this slide, I'd like to discuss a few of the problems about these traditional terms. First of all, the word poltergeist, haunting, the words poltergeist, haunting, and ghost all imply post-carnate agency, discarnate agency, which is just one interpretation of the phenomena. But if you talk to a member of the public, and indeed to some people who call themselves paranormal investigators, about ghosts, they'll immediately think in terms of a discarnate spirit. And hauntings, the derivation of the term would suggest a recurrent spirit. So these expressions are theoretically biased. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the discarnate agency is never involved in these cases. It may be in some cases. In fact, I'll be mentioning a case where there could be a superficial, at least a degree of support for the discarnate agency theory. But I don't think we should just assume that a discarnate agency is always involved. And these question-begging, biased terms certainly carry that implication, and that's a problem. Another problem is that the word poltergeist, which comes from German and it literally means noisy spirit, is used by some people quite gratuitously and unnecessarily. The late Harry Price, whom most of you will have heard of, who died, I think, in 1948, was a well-known psychical researcher. He investigated physical mediums. He also investigated spontaneous cases. He wrote a couple of books about the Borley Rectory case, for instance. Now, in 1945, a book by him was published called Poltergeist Over England. And the title of the book was absurd because the book contains chapters on cases in England, but also cases in Scotland. And also there's one from Barbados, which is hardly England. The second way in which the title of the book is misleading and wrong and perhaps absurd is that the cases aren't all poltergeist cases. One of the cases, for instance, in the book is a well-known case from Hampshire in the 18th century concerning a manor house at the Hinton-Ampner, not too far east of Winchester. Now, this case, if you go into the case, you read it carefully, the phenomena were more or less entirely sensory. I've not seen in reading about the case any mention of objects being displaced, fires breaking out, inundations of water, objects appearing, disappearing mysteriously, nothing really physical. Couple of apparitional reports from the case, at least two, I think. And in the main, the phenomena, although they became quite intense, were primarily auditory. Murmuring sounds, other sounds of people talking, crashing or the slamming of doors, with no real evidence to suggest that doors really had slammed. But this case, as I say, it doesn't have any distinctive poltergeist features, and it appears in Price's book. And the title of the book is therefore mistaken. Just recently, I came across an article on the Spooky Isles website, which some of you may know, and it was an article by Paul Adams on what's sometimes called the Cheltenham ghost, a case from the 1880s. This case came to the attention of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. At the time, Frederick Myers, one of the founders of the SPR, was living in Cheltenham, and the principal recipient was a woman called Rosina Despard, and she contributed an article to the SPR journal under the pseudonym R.C. Morton, the Morton being the pseudonymous bit, called Record of a Haunted House. And if you read the story, you'll come across reports of unusual apparitional appearances, in that the apparition, which was that of a woman dressed in black, widow weeds perhaps, with a handkerchief held up to her lower face. This apparition was allegedly seen for very lengthy periods, maybe up to half an hour, which is unusual in cases classed as hauntings or poltergeists. Usually apparitional appearances are fleeting. During the 1880s, there were no poltergeist phenomena at all, as far as I can tell from my reading about the case. And yet, the article by Paul Adams is titled, if I can find the, just bear with me a second. Oh yes, was the Cheltenham poltergeist the real woman in black? Now, in fairness to Paul, who is a good, interesting writer, he's written on Borley Rectory and other cases, I believe, but in fairness to Paul, I know from my own experience of submitting material to Spooky Isles that the title of your submitted piece may be changed. So in other words, it could be that Paul didn't use that title. He maybe submitted his article under a different title, and it's an editorial change here, and this word poltergeist has been introduced, but it's completely misleading, because the phenomena in the 1880s were not poltergeist type. Now, I'm going to talk now about these two relevant studies before going on to some case examples. which hopefully will illustrate some of the problems with the traditional classification. Alan Gould, as a veteran psychical researcher, he, along with Tony Connell, published a book called Poltergeists. Originally, I think it was 1979 originally, and it's been republished by White Crow Books in 2017. And as part of the study, as part of his approach to this question of the relation between hauntings and poltergeists, Gould carried out a complicated series of analyses called cluster analysis to a sample of 500 cases taken from the literature, looking at the degree to which different phenomena hung together, correlated, and whether there was any sort of whether these correlations or clustering accorded with the traditional understanding of hauntings and poltergeists. And indeed, he did find that the clusters he derived from this did broadly, correspond to the traditional ideas of the difference between haunting and poltergeist cases. However, he did say that some cases, that the analysis did show some cases which had hitherto been thought of largely as poltergeist cases wound up in the haunting category, and he suggested that the two categories could be composite rather than unitary. A more recent study is reported in a book by Brian Lath et al., which I've referenced there. You can see it, Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters. And this was an online study where people were asked about spontaneous ghostly experiences they'd had. They were given a 32-item inventory dealing with different types of experience. And what the investigators found was that people reported experiences which varied along a dimension or what they call a haunt hierarchy in terms of the probability of experiences being reported. The more common experiences, such as experiencing a sense of presence, experiencing electrical malfunctions, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. That means they were the most probable type of things, more likely than some of the other phenomena at the top of the hierarchy, which were rare but would occur in more dramatic cases, such as seeing folkloric entities, such as fairies, or fires occurring apparently paranormally. The phenomena of that type were at the other end of the hierarchy, the infrequent, less probable. And what Lath et al. State is that they found that if you look at different points on the hierarchy, at the different points, you get both subjective and objective phenomena, which broadly concurs with my experience, limited as it is, based on case investigation, and also my reading of the literature, that the typical spontaneous recurrent phenomena case will involve both physical, objective phenomena and also subjective experiences. That's not to say there aren't cases of pure culture. A while back, I published a little article in Seriously Strange magazine on sensory hauntings. I mentioned some cases where there were sort of recurrent phenomena which seem to be more or less purely sensory. So you can find these cases. But the more typical kind of case you'll find is one where you get both types of phenomena. Just to give you a very, very brief and quick example of a sensory haunting type case, as I've already mentioned the Cheltenham ghost, which is a good example, but one of my informants, a man called Hunter, he told me of an experience he'd had in the United Arab Emirates in a hotel of seeing an apparitional figure in his bedroom. It was a man who looked of Indian appearance, who walked through a gable wall. Hunter was a bit disturbed by this, but tried to put it down to imagination or a nightmare or something like that. But a year later, another engineer, Hunter was worked as an engineer. Another engineer was in a room adjacent to Hunter's previous accommodation in the hotel, and he had a very similar experience and was disturbed by it and insisted on being located in a different hotel. He wasn't satisfied with being given a change of room. He wanted to go to another hotel, which was arranged. So that's the problem here, that the majority of cases, it seems, do involve both sensory and physical phenomena. And this causes a problem, because if you've got physical and sensory phenomena, at what point, how many cases, how many instances of physical phenomena do you have to have before you deem the case to be poltergeist rather than haunting? Another big problem is that it's often hard to tell in practice whether the phenomena are place linked. Let me give you an example. In 1999, a widow contacted me regarding experiences she and her members of her family were having in their home. Now, the story was that in the spring of 1990, the widow's husband died of cancer. And about 9 months later, phenomena started occurring in the house, footsteps. There were objective phenomena as well, such as electrical switches going off by themselves. The woman then started having sleep paralysis type experiences, which she found disconcerting. These manifestations continued for some 9 years, or more than 9 years. I visited the property. I spoke to the widow. I spoke to her 2 sons, one of whom had left home by that time. I also corresponded with a visitor to the house. And fortunately for the widow, actually, the phenomena fizzled out. And I think one of my last communication with her was in 2001. And I think she said things were all quiet. And I did say, get in touch if there's any, recurrence or anything like that. But I've lost contact with her now, so I presume that the case did die a death, run its course. Now, if that hadn't happened, if phenomena had continued and eventually the family had vacated the home, maybe moved on to some other area or something like that, another family had moved in and they had reported similar phenomena, one would be in a better position to say that, yes, this was a place-linked case, not maybe a person-centered case. But I just don't know in this case whether the phenomena were linked to the members of primarily to the members of the house, or to the property itself. And I can think of another case I investigated where it was the same story, mixture of sensory and physical phenomena. Eventually the phenomena fizzled out, kept in touch with the people concerned. Everything was gone quiet. So again, it was difficult to know. In this particular case, the second one I'm referring to, there were some family tensions, and it's conceivable that those tensions played a role in the phenomena. But whether there was any place-linked aspect, I just don't know. Next slide, please, CJ. I've really just addressed the things in this slide. Next one, please, CJ. Right, I want to introduce now. Is it possible to move the text to the left a bit so people can see the? I don't know whether you can see all of that. I can't see it all, but this is a hypothetical model that addresses the question of interaction. My guess is that if there are place and person-centered aspects to recurrent cases, there's probably a complex interaction rather than it being one or the other. It's not place-centered or person-centered, it's probably a bit of both. And if you think about interaction, you can get slightly counter-expectational predictions. So let's assume for this model that each any person can be given a score on a scale 0 to 10, representing their proclivity to generate paranormal phenomena. Now, it may be that most people don't have any proclivity to generate paranormal phenomena, spontaneous phenomena, as they go about their business, and they will be 0 on the scale. And let's also assume, for the sake of argument, that places themselves can have a score 0 to 10. Representing the degree to which they tend to engender paranormal effects. And let's further imagine, for the sake of argument, that we can add these scores together to produce a combined effect scale ranging from 0 to 20. And as a further assumption, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that if a personal score, a place score, or a combined effect score is 5 or more, manifestations will definitely occur. A score of 6 signifies phenomena of low intensity, though, and low frequency, with higher scores being associated with more intense and more frequent manifestations. So in this very simple hypothetical model, the variables are simply additive. They add together. In reality, it'll be more complicated than that, but this is just for the sake of argument. Now, I'd like to discuss some scenarios which would be predicted by this simple model. Next slide, please, CJ. The first 3 of these scenarios are pretty obvious. Sheila's personal score is 8. The threshold is between 5 and 6. Therefore, phenomena will occur wherever Sheila lives. She doesn't have to be living in a haunted house. Phenomena will occur wherever she lives. And if you're living with Sheila, you'll for any prolonged period of time, you'll probably experience phenomena too. Next one, Bob has a personal score of 0, but he moves to a house with a place score of 8, which is above the threshold. Therefore, he'll experience manifestations. And in popular parlance, he's simply moved into he's not a particularly psychically prone person himself, but he's moved into a haunted house. Therefore, he'll experience manifestations. Mark scores 5 on the personal scale, lives in a house with a place score of 1. Combined effect score of 5 is below the threshold, and provided no one else comes along with a personal score to add to the mix, phenomena won't occur. Now, the fourth one is the interesting one here, because Julie's personal score is 4, her flat has a place score of 1, and the combined effect score is therefore 5, and it's not sufficient for phenomena to occur. But Julie has a friend called Kate, who's just broken up with her husband and doesn't have anywhere to live. And it's going to take a month or 2 for Kate to sort out accommodation. And Julie kindly invites Kate to move in, pending finding a place of her own. Kate takes up the offer. Now, Kate happens to have a personal score of 2, which raises the combined effect score to 7, and therefore phenomena break out. After a couple of months or so, Kate finds accommodation and moves out. The combined effect score at Julie's property drops back to 5, and the phenomena cease. Now, from the point of view of outside observers or people interested in parapsychology, psychical research, this might seem to be a clear-cut case of Kate being the focal person. No phenomena occurred at Julie's home until Kate moved in, phenomena broke out, and then after Kate left, the phenomena ceased. And therefore, there may be a tendency to, if I can use the word blame Kate. Kate was the focal person. But in fact, as you can see in this hypothetical example, Kate's personal score is actually half that of Julie's. What Kate did by moving in was tip the balance. And the causal factors were more complicated than an either or thing. It was distributed across the place. and the two occupants. And in fact, if the local parapsychology department thought that Kate was the focal person, invited her down to the lab to run some psychokinesis tests, they would probably get less impressive results than if they invited Julie along, because, as I say, in this example, Julie has a personal score of 4. So this illustrates how, when you think of interaction, you can get, maybe you've got to be careful in how you conceptualize the relation between people and the phenomena that occur around them. Next slide, please, CJ. Now, this is coming back to the real world. As I say, my guess is the relation between personal and place factors may be quite complex. I also strongly suspect that if people do have a proclivity to generate paranormal phenomena, spontaneous paranormal phenomena, when as they go where they're living, or even in their workplaces, this changes over time. It's probably dependent on a whole host of factors, including mental and physical health, their relations with how well they get on with people at the place of work or the other members of the home. And their age as well. So it won't be, a person won't have a fixed score that stays with them like a national insurance number throughout their life. This will be a variable quality. Similarly, I suspect that with regard to place factors, if there are such things, again, this may vary over time. It could depend on weather phenomena. It could depend on fluctuating seismicity, or whether there's maybe an active geological fault beneath the property, the time of year. So there could be a complex interaction. Next slide, please, CJ. Now, I want to discuss a few cases which illustrate this problem about splitting cases into these two traditional categories of haunting and poltergeist. This was a case that was reported by Sir William Barrett, who was a physicist, I believe, a member of the Royal Society, an early member of the Society for Psychical Research. And as you'll see, he published a paper called Investigation of a Haunted House in Worcestershire. And this was in the SPR journal. The title of Barrett's paper was it was a bit of a misnomer, really, because the circumstances of the case, as he presented them, suggested that maybe the house wasn't haunted, or perhaps not. The location was a rented house, unspecified precisely where it was, but it was in rural Worcestershire. The person who contacted Barrett, I don't know whether this was a letter to the SPR or whether this person somehow knew Barrett, knew of Barrett and personally addressed the letter to him, I don't know. But Barrett was contacted, and the woman is referred to in Barrett's paper as a Mrs. Roberts. Now, she and her husband were renting a house. I think it must have been a fairly sizable house because they had domestic staff. And they'd been there for, I think it was something like just under 3 years, and nothing much had happened except a couple of occasions when some odd noises, but Mrs. Roberts didn't seem to want to make too much of them. But then they employed an elderly cook, and sometime, not shortly after, maybe a matter of weeks or months after the cook arrived, phenomena started occurring. And I'll just give you some examples. I'll just read briefly from Barrett's paper. I'll just give you one or two examples here. The first experience was by someone called Dorothy L. There's obviously a degree of anonymization going on here, but who told Barrett, I was in Mrs. Roberts' bedroom, I think she was tidying it up or something, one Sunday evening last March, about 8 p.m, when I heard a groaning under the bed. It sounded very like a dog moaning and occurred twice over. There was a bedroom lamplight in the room, but I saw nothing to account for the sound. Suddenly, as I was standing by the dressing table, I felt a hand placed on my chest, and I was pushed over by the pressure back to the dressing table. A moment later, I saw a figure, as if coming from under the bed, moving across the room towards the door. I only saw the back of the figure, which was tall and white-clothed. I distinctly heard its footsteps on the landing outside. I was so petrified that I was unable to stir for a minute or two, and I was afraid of screaming, as it would have frightened the children who were in bed in the adjoining room. As soon as I recovered, I rushed downstairs and told the cook what had happened. And later on, I told the head nurse, who informed Mrs. Roberts. Now, I'm going to quote from a woman referred to as Ethel, who had some experience. I'll just put, she had a series of experiences. I'll just mention a couple of them. I was in bed in my room, the night nursery, which is over the day nursery. I heard the window of the room below suddenly thrown open and then shut down again, and the furniture knocked about in the room below. I got up and lit my candle and found it was 1:30 a.m. I was too frightened to go downstairs by myself and was going to call Mr. Roberts when the sound ceased, after going on for nearly 15 minutes. I then lay down again and waited, but nothing more occurred that night. The only other persons in my bedroom were the two children, who were fast asleep. When I got up in the morning early, I went to the room below and examined the room. Nothing was disturbed. The windows were fastened and the door locked as usual. So these were sort of fairly typical sensory haunt-type phenomena. The only question I'd have about this pushing, her being pushed, whether a force really was applied to her or whether this was a sensory impression that wasn't accompanied by an actual physical force, I don't know. I'll move forward just to mention perhaps what the worst experience was for this witness and perhaps for the people during these events in the house. A few days later, a horrible experience happened to me. I had been in bed some time but was not asleep when a hand suddenly gripped my throat and another hand gripped the side of my body. The grip on the throat was so violent that it hurt, but did not choke me. I managed to light the candle after a few minutes and found it was 1:30 a.m. The children were fast asleep and no one else was in the room. I am sure it was not a nightmare. After that, I always kept a light burning in my room all night, and nothing like this experience happened again, though I have heard unaccountable noises several times. Now, Barrett visited this property. Nothing happened while he was there. He was there for a couple of nights, I think, and he examined the rooms and interviewed the witnesses, including the cook, whom I've mentioned. And I'll just quote regarding the cook, who said, Dorothy on the Sunday came downstairs and told me of the fright she had had and the apparition she saw in Mrs. Roberts' bedroom, but I could not believe her. However, a little while afterwards, I heard a groaning in my bedroom and the noise of someone going out of the room, but I saw nothing. I was in bed when the groaning woke me up. The room was quite dark and I was too frightened to stir or light the candle. Another night I heard stamping around as if someone was walking heavily across the room. This time I did get up and light the candle and went outside on the landing. The time was 2 a.m. On at least half a dozen other occasions I heard similar sounds after midnight, but saw nothing. For the last week or two I have heard nothing. When I lived with a family in the Isle of Wight, I also heard on several occasions curious noises which could not be explained. The sounds were like someone smashing crockery or moving furniture and sometimes footsteps. These sounds were also heard by my mistress and others, and they were much frightened and said it was dreadful. Now, again, these phenomena sound very haunt-like rather than poltergeist type. The cook left in that summer I don't know whether she was employed on a temporary basis, but she left, and Mrs. Roberts reported by letter to William Barrett that almost immediately the atmosphere in the place improved, and the implication being that somehow the cook was responsible for the phenomena. However, in haunt type cases, phenomena can be quite intermittent and can drag on, or can reverberate on for years. So you'd need to study things over a long period of time before you could say the manifestations really had ceased. But the Roberts, Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, and presumably their children, they moved away actually that autumn. So it's difficult to know whether it was related purely to the presence of the cook. But going back to the hypothetical example of Kate and Julie I mentioned a little while ago, I don't think should be wary perhaps of giving the elderly cook a really bad rap. It might be assumed from the fact that phenomena seem to occur after she arrived and seemed to cease when she left, that she was somehow responsible. But again, it could be that she just tipped the balance. And a disappointing feature of Barrett's report, although it's perhaps that with time, people are more sophisticated now, more knowledgeable about what we should ask and to get more information. There's no mention of how the cook got on with her employers, or indeed with the other members of the household. It would be interesting to know, for instance, whether she had a bad relationship with them, because there is the view with regard to poltergeist cases, at least, that sometimes phenomena relate to unconscious hostility or anger or frustration. And it could be that she didn't get on with members of the household, and that could have been a factor. As I say, though, it could also be that the cook was only partly responsible for what happened there. In a sense, there was a complex interaction, and it may have depended as much on other members of the household as the cook herself. So this is a case that illustrates how tricky it is with how this simple distinction between poltergeist, place-linked hauntings, person-centered poltergeist cases doesn't always work very well. What we seem to have here is a possible case where haunt-type phenomena were associated with a person primarily rather than the person, but it's the full details we'll never know. Next slide, please, CJ. This is a case that came to my attention in the year 2000, I think it was. A woman I'll call Mrs. Black, pseudonym, wrote to me about phenomena that had occurred both in her then house, the house she was living in then, and a previous house. The previous house she'd moved into in August 1991, and she left in 1998. When she moved in, the house was, by the way, associated with her employers. I don't know whether it just went with the job or whether she had to pay rent, but it was associated with her employers, and it was situated near an active Royal Air Force base. And she experienced various phenomena. When she moved into the property, she was single. She was alone. I think she acquired some kittens, a couple of kittens eventually, but initially she lived there alone, and she was married, I think, in 1994. Her husband shared the house with her, and they had a couple of children a couple of boys while they were actually still at the house, and left, as I say, in January 1998. Now, Mrs. Black and her husband reported various phenomena. Again, there was a mixture of physical and sensory phenomena. For instance, among the sensory phenomena, Mrs. Black would sometimes have a sense of presence, that someone was looking over her shoulder when she was at the kitchen sink. She told me just to give one or two examples of an occasion she was in bed in a room downstairs, and then she heard a tapping sound coming from the ceiling, And when she turned the light on, I believe the tapping ceased. When she turned the light back off, the noises started up again. And this went on, and she eventually abandoned that room for the night. She was finding it disturbing. There were electrical problems with telephones, and one or more telephones, and at times the hi-fi unit, which was left on standby, would sometimes come on at full blast, full volume. I did wonder whether these electrical problems could possibly be related to the Air Force base, whether some sort of electromagnetic interference could be occurring. And I wrote to the station commander, but I didn't get the courtesy of a reply, so I don't know about that. The family, sorry, just before I move on to the next house, I should say that there was an experience Mrs. Black had with her first son. He was about 2, I think, at the time. She was I think, sitting on a sofa. The son was sitting on the floor playing while she was watching television. And then the son pointed and said, "Look, Mummy, look." And she followed the direction of his pointing and saw what looked like light cigarette smoke. I think it rolled off the sofa and moved across the floor and disappeared behind an item. And she and her son followed that and looked, couldn't see anything. She did subsequently mention this indirectly to a man who'd lived in the house for some time, but he seemed a bit incredulous. I should say that her son came up with the name Thomas, and an image came into Mrs. Black's mind of a boy, a little boy, and her son came up with the name Thomas, and she mentioned this Thomas to this former resident who seemed incredulous. But another former resident of the property, as a child, reported an occasion when she'd seen dancing nebulous forms in the property. So it's very tenuous evidence that there may have been some kind of phenomenon that was repeated, or phenomena. At any rate, Mrs. Black and her family moved to a newish house, which was in January 1998. I think the new house had only been built about 4 years before. And there were some phenomena there, but they were of a different character. For instance, I think sons were one day looking into their bedroom and claimed that they'd heard a toy, one of their toys talking. I think they claimed to have seen a monster in their cupboard on another occasion and seemed genuinely frightened. Mrs. Black herself was in bed. She thought she was awake. She heard what sounded like a man ascending the stairs with a bunch of keys by his side, the keys rattling. At times she smelt cigarette smoke in the house or in the garage, although neither she nor her husband smoked. So again, we've got a problem here. This case doesn't fit neatly into the kind of poltergeist divide. One could say that Mrs. Black was in the situation of moving from one haunted house into another. The evidence for the first house being haunted is a bit tenuous. Another possibility is that phenomena somehow attached themselves to her. A contagion process occurred, attached themselves to the family, perhaps more generally. Another possibility is that Mrs. Black was somehow unconsciously generating the phenomena herself. Another possibility is that some sort of external agent was orchestrating phenomena for some purpose. So again, it's difficult to categorize in neat terms into haunt or poltergeist. Next slide, please, CJ. This was another case that this came to my attention when I worked for the clinical psychologist. A man in his 50s, I think, I'll refer to him as James Montgomery, pseudonymously, described a succession of disturbing phenomena he'd experienced in a flat in the East End of Glasgow. He occupied the flat, I think it was from 1992 to 1997. I'd have to check that actually, but he was there for a few years, several years. And the phenomena were again a mixture of physical and sensory. Just to give you a couple of examples of the physical phenomena, there was one time when his daughter and her partner came up to visit Mr. Montgomery for the Christmas period with their recently born child. And the couple went out at one point and left Mr. Montgomery to mind the child. A neighbor popped in and took hold of the child, was holding the child, when a photograph flew off the television set in Mr. Montgomery's room and landed on the floor some feet away. Whether it was symbolic or not, the photograph depicted the mother, Mr. Montgomery's daughter, holding the baby. On another occasion, a neighbor popped in to see, this was in one summer, Mr. Montgomery, she placed a newspaper on a coffee table, and it moved horizontally and then just dropped to the floor. A couple of occasions, a light failed. There seemed to be a problem with the bulb, and Mr. Montgomery found that the light bulbs had been moved mysteriously. In one of these, I should explain, one of these occasions, he was downstairs putting out some rubbish. He saw a light go out in the flat. Worried about whether an intruder had entered, rushed up to the flat and found that the light bulb was out of its fixture. So these were physical phenomena. Whether they were physical enough to constitute poltergeist tag, whether we give it that label, or whether we regard this as a case of haunting with physical characteristics is a moot point. Mr. Montgomery moved to another flat. He wasn't there, he was only there for 2 years, but he experienced one or two things there. I think it was switches going off or something of that nature. Then moved to another couple of flats, and further phenomena occurred, not at the same intensity of frequency as in the first flat, but phenomena occurred. There was a slight fly in the ointment with this case, because I wrote an article, which I've referenced here, as you can see at the top, that was published in the Paranormal Review. And I sent a copy to a colleague in Scotland called Ron Halliday, who's a writer and an investigator himself. And Ron eventually asked me whether he could draw on my paper for a book he was writing. The book was called Haunted Glasgow, published, I think, in 2008. And I said to Ron, I said, well, why don't you actually, if Mr. Montgomery's agreed, why don't you actually interview him yourself? Because you'll get first-hand testimony. And so he was happy to go along with that. I contacted James Montgomery, who was willing to be interviewed by Ron. And he told Ron of an occasion when some money that he'd left on a counter in his kitchenette had disappeared. He went out of the flat, came back, found the money had disappeared, and was a bit concerned about that, and spent quite a lot of time searching for it, couldn't find it. The amount of money, according to what he told me, was £8. But what he told Ron, and this is what concerned me slightly regarding James's memory, was he said it was almost £57. Now that's a strangely detailed recollection of how much the money was, and yet it's discrepant with what he told me or informed me. I don't think James Montgomery was lying to me. I didn't get the impression he was being fraudulent or dishonest, but it did raise the question of unconscious confabulation. And of course, if unconscious confabulation had occurred regarding the sum of money that went missing, if indeed a sum of money did go missing, one has to ask, were some of the other reported phenomena quite as they were reported? But leaving that little concern aside, this is another phenomenon, another case which doesn't permit easy classification. I'm beginning to run out of time, I think, so I'll speed up a bit. Next slide, please.
Peter, please take as long as you need. Don't worry about the time.
Okay, thank you very much. Next slide then, please. Thank you. This is an interesting one. It's a case in East Fife. Fife is a sort of county. It used to be a county anyway. So above, between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Tay. The eastern part sticks out into the North Sea. It's a peninsula. And this case involves a house that's no longer in existence. It was demolished a while back, called Pitmilly House. And it was built, I think probably about 1800. I'm not sure about that, but initially it was owned by, it was occupied by members of a family called Moneypenny, and then Captain Jeffrey took possession. Jeffrey was married. He had a daughter and a son. The son around this time was married, and this was in the sort of late 30s, and very, very physical poltergeist phenomena reportedly occurred there. The case is reported by Harry Price in his book, Poltergeist over England, or Poltergeist Tales of the Supernatural. That's the title by which it was republished later in 1993. Price doesn't identify the location. I think he would have liked to have identified it, but because of confidentiality reasons regarding his informant, I think he didn't feel free to identify it. But it was Pitmilly House. It's also discussed in these other sources I've mentioned. Indeed, there are other sources which I haven't personally consulted. Very decidedly physical phenomena of furniture being moved about, many things being smashed, objects flying through the air, destructive phenomena, fires, multiple fires broke out on I think in just one day. As with other poltergeist cases, there were some claims that maybe there's a bit of fakery going on. This tends to happen with dramatic cases, and it doesn't necessarily make me think that there necessarily was fraud. There were tensions in the family. The Jeffreys' daughter was educated at home at her mother's insistence. I don't know why that was. I mean, she could have gone to school in St Andrews, which isn't only a few miles from Pitmilly House, would have been. But the mother insisted that she be educated at home, and the daughter, it seems, wasn't very happy about that. During the early war years, or the beginning of that, around that time, the daughter was going out with a Polish soldier, I think his name was Rostorowski, surname, and Rostorowski himself witnessed phenomena. He suspected that maybe the phenomena were being generated, presumably unconsciously, by Captain Jeffrey, who was perhaps angry that his daughter was consorting with a foreigner. Mrs. Jeffrey was apparently resentful about her husband's drinking, and her husband died quite young. I think it was about 1942. I'd have to check that, to be honest, but he died. The house was requisitioned by the military, and I think the Jeffreys left around that time, or left presumably before the military took over. And then after the war, it became a hotel and remained so, I think, till about 1967. And there were reportedly poltergeist-type phenomena during its time as a hotel. Problem with this case is that it seems very impressive as far as poltergeist case goes, because the phenomena seem to span a period of some 30 years, which is a really long period for a poltergeist case. However, I don't know whether the poltergeist activity was continuous, or continual, I should say, throughout these 30 years, or whether the phenomena occurred in fits and starts. If that were the case, it could be that each individual episode was essentially independent. I think one has to bear this in mind with hotels. We often hear of haunted pubs, haunted hotels. Unlike an ordinary house where you might have just an ordinary sized family living there for a fairly lengthy period without much turnover of people, if you've got a hotel that does a fairly brisk business, over the course of the years, a lot of people would have passed through that place and stayed there briefly. So if you have, say, 1 in 100 persons or 1 in 50 can generate paranormal phenomena wherever they go, you're more likely to have people of that type if you've got a business like a hotel than if it's an ordinary home. So it could be that some of the phenomena, if the phenomena were occurring quite frequently when it was a hotel, were unconnected essentially with what went on in the late 30s or the mid to late 30s. Could be different incidents rather than one continuous poltergeist episode. So again, this is a case that it raises the question here whether the phenomena could have been person-centered rather than place-centered, place-centered, could have been related to the place rather than to any given person. It's unlikely, in my estimation, that any one person was consistently present on the premises for 30 odd years. I would have liked to have shown a picture of Pitmilly House. I did find some on the internet, but I wasn't sure about the copyright situation with regard to these pictures. I did write to Lorne McIntyre, whom I'd been in touch with sometime previously, but I didn't get a reply using the email address I used. And because Lorne would be quite elderly if he's still alive, I thought, well, I better just leave it there. But next slide, please, CJ. This slide shows the area roughly. This was a skydive I did with a friend called Alan Ramsey in 2002, 22 years ago. And this picture was taken over East Fife. And you can see at the bottom, the tip of Fife, the easternmost tip, known as Fife Ness, sticking out into the North Sea. And if you follow the coastline to the left, if you come to the extreme bottom left-hand corner of the picture, I think Pitmilly House would have been located about there. It may be slightly further to the left, but that just gives you a rough idea of the area. It's sort of fairly flat, the area, the agricultural land. Pitmilly House was fairly near the sea, I'd say about 3 or 4 fields back from the coast. Next slide, please, CJ. Finally, final case was one I may have mentioned to ASSAP before, and I can't remember this, but I think it was 2007, I heard from a member of BUFORA, the British UFO Research Association, that people were making sort of pilgrimages to Rendlesham Forest and going there at night and coming away reporting unusual experiences. And my informant was skeptical. I think he thought that these reported phenomena, were probably of a sort of psychosocial nature. They were maybe misinterpretation of normal sensations or normal stimuli. But I was intrigued, so I decided to make some inquiries myself. And although I lived hundreds of miles away from there, I decided to make a visit to the area, and I contacted a person who was associated with the case, and she kindly invited me to her place and gave me information. And I spoke to people during my trip, and also subsequently I was in touch with others. And the people who were making these visits to the forest, which was no doubt related in part to the well-known UFO incident that occurred or incidents, I should say in the plural, that occurred at Rendlesham Forest in December 1980. That was probably the thing that was sort of gave rise to these visits. But people were going there, going maybe on a Saturday night, gathering together, meeting up, and going for walks in the forest at night. And they were coming away with photographs or photographic images, maybe reports of seeing monk-like figures or other strange things, maybe lights in the sky, this sort of thing. Now, it occurred to me that looking at it, sort of trying to be as objective as possible, that it could be that many of these reports were based on normal factors. For instance, if you go to a place like Rendlesham Forest with a digital camera and you start firing off shots in the dark, you're using the camera probably outside its normal range of use, and abnormalities on the images could be attributed to that rather than to anything paranormal. Similarly, if you're looking at the sky and so on, it could be that the usual sort of things could be misidentified, satellites, even aircraft, and so on. Another factor could be that if people are visiting the forest at night, going for walks there into the early hours of the morning, maybe sleep deprivation could generate unusual experiences. However, an interesting and intriguing phenomenon, which was reported to me by several witnesses, was walking through the forest, either day or night, and a hot or warm stone would drop down beside them. And when picked up, the stone would be smooth, not rough. And I received testimony about this sort of poltergeist-like phenomenon from about 7 witnesses, and then I subsequently heard from other people, 1 or 2 other people at least, who had this experience in the forest. And this didn't seem to happen when any given person was consistently present. One witness, for instance, told me he was on this track that's shown in this photograph, and he spoke out loud and said something like, "Are you from another dimension?" And a stone dropped down. He then asked whether a stone could be dropped behind him, I think it was, and that obligingly happened. Things like that. So there was an interactive aspect to the phenomenon, coming from different witnesses, different times. It seems unlikely that it's fraud, because if anyone were carrying out these, armed with a catapult and maybe heating up stones with a cigarette lighter, they'd have to have been spent an awful lot of time skulking around the forest, hoping that people can be walking by to give them this experience. So this raises the question whether this poltergeist-like phenomenon could have been related to the place. Another thought I had about this case was that there could have been a kind of group mind effect. If you've got a group of people, let's say it's 15 or more friends, associates, who were fascinated with Rendlesham Forest, going there hoping to experience paranormal phenomena, that this gives rise to this creates a sort of group mind effect whereby they themselves are generating the phenomena. Another possibility is that something external is generating the phenomenon, some sort of intelligence that is laying on these performances. I was recently in touch with Brenda Butler, who was one of the people who used to go down to the forest quite regularly. And I asked her whether people are still making these visits, and she said, no, it seems to have stopped now. But if you happen to live in that part of England, it's Suffolk, or near there, it might be, you're interested in visiting the forest at night and going for a walk, it might be worth doing that. I would suggest, of course, for your personal safety, not because of any concerns about paranormal phenomena, but for your safety, that you do it with 2 or 3 others, just for personal safety. But it could be that who knows, you might have an interesting experience. I did contact the head forest ranger. This was back probably in 2007, asking whether any of the forestry workers had this experience with the hot stones or warm stones, but he didn't think that was the case. So this is an interesting one, possible place link, poltergeist type manifestation. No definite link with one identified human agent. Next slide, please, CJ. I've already mentioned this concept of contagion, but I think this is a concept worth considering with these haunting and poltergeist type cases. And it complicates the issue a bit. Instead of just being place-centered or person-centered, Person-to-person contagion would be, as in this hypothetical example, where Mary generates paranormal effects. Colleagues and people notice that things happen in her presence and maybe even follow them home. Person-to-place contagion would be, as I say, in this hypothetical example, where Mary stays somewhere, where places where Mary stays, if she's having this effect on the environment, she sort of adds a charge to the location, meaning that people who subsequently occupy the premises could also find themselves experiencing odd phenomena. So this would be an element of place-to-person contagion. And this may be going on in some of these cases as a factor that is often not perhaps taken fully into account. This question of contagion has been written about by Darren Ritson in connection with the South Shields Poltergeist case. And it's also occurred reportedly at the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. People who visited the ranch have sometimes had phenomena follow them home. And there's even a suggestion that some people, the family members of people who visited the ranch, have sometimes gone down with autoimmune diseases. I don't know whether the data on this amounts to statistical significance. I don't think it did, according to a book that I've drawn on for this. But it's something that maybe needs attention. It needs to be watched and to be considered. I mean, the bottom line, I suppose, is that if you visit places where strange things are going on, you may not always get away scot-free. Next slide, please, CJ. So this is just the final wrapping up. There's one slide after this. It's just a few references. But given all the problems associated with the terms haunting and poltergeist, I think we should stop trying to categorize cases using these unsatisfactory labels. I would suggest simply using a broader category, recurrent paranormal activity. It's a simple descriptive term and it's free of unwelcome baggage. It doesn't carry the kind of implied belief in the survival hypothesis, which may or may not be true, but it's a simple descriptive term. Similarly, I would suggest binning the word ghost. I think this is a kind of term that's very strongly associated with spiritualistic notions. I think it belongs in the bin, and we can readily substitute the word apparition for ghost. I mean, even using the word ghost is ambiguous, because some people use the word ghost for any kind of animate apparition. Others might be more restrictive and only use the word ghost for a recurrent apparition, one that's seen on more than one occasion. But I'd suggest just getting rid of the term and using the word apparition. And if it's a recurrent apparition, just describe it as such. I think it would make our discourse sound more scientific than using these old theory-laden, question-begging expressions. So that's it. The next slide, please. This final slide, CJ. These are just some of the publications I think I've mentioned in there's actually one there I didn't get around to mentioning, D. Scott Rogo, but I won't bother with that now. But in the book I've mentioned by W.G. Roll, the article by W.G. Roll in this Handbook of Parapsychology, that's where he points out that an appreciable number of poltergeist cases do feature apparitions. G.N.M. Tyrrell was a psychical researcher, former president of the SPR, who advanced a sort of telepathic theory of apparitions, which CJ has written about quite recently on the Facebook group. So that's it. So if there's time and any questions or comments, I'll hand over to people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I will just stop the share. I believe Christian will be doing the questions tonight. Is that right, Christian?
I can do if that's what you'd like me to do.
Well, I will start off with a simple question or two. Firstly, Dot Street, Brenda Butler, back in the 80s, they were everywhere. They are the people who really made Rendlesham famous. There would never have been a Rendlesham. It would never have been more than a very minor case, I think, if they hadn't done so much work on it. And Jenny Randall's picked that up, and she was the person who made it respectable, I think. But regardless of that, I mean, I think that Brenda, wherever Brenda is, there's paranormal activity. I think that's the best way to put it. That she's usually at the heart of things, much as wherever I seem to go, things seem to happen. So, yeah, that's an interesting one. There's a lot of stuff which goes on up at Rendlesham. My family are up that part. Some of my family are up there. I'm not. I'm completely the other side of the country now. Regarding the Cheltenham ghost, I have a couple of photos. Let me just see if I can get them up. So this is the location of the Cheltenham ghost. How do I do that?
Remove the spotlight.
I'm just going to share this if I can, but I've got to get back to Zoom. So this is the back of the house. Sorry, that's the front of the house. Can you see that?
Yes.
And right, so Imogen's room was up here, and the ghost was said to be that of Imogen Swin, her former. And the room, I believe, in which this room here is the room in which Rosina was. It's either that one or that one. And there were some, it depends how you define poltergeist, because it's a rather nebulous term. I mean, footsteps were defined as being physical phenomena, for example, by the SPR in that period. But there were some strange events that occurred during the haunting, one of which was a series of lights, like candle flames, but not attached to anything, that float around in the hallway just outside there. Let me just show you if I can find it. Go back to my messages with Richard, which I just used for the purpose of. So this is one of Kate Sherrill, Dr. Kate Sherrill, dressed in Victorian mourning gear. I think it's rather marvelous. This is what the apparition would have looked like. Just quickly show you that. Can you see that? She was a lady dressed in black Victorian mourning gear. Can you see the picture, Peter?
Yes.
And finally, because I can, let's just have one more look at the house. I wrote a 49-page article on the Cheltenham ghost that's in the Anomaly before last, and I took quite a detailed breakdown of it. But when you mentioned it, I just thought I'd share these very quick. This is the back of the house, and famously the children supposedly danced around the ghost, formed hands around the ghost, and the ghost disappeared from within the middle of them. There we go. And
you've probably mentioned this in your article, Chris, but the late Peter Underwood suggested that the apparition wasn't an apparition; it was actually a real woman.
Yeah,
and that the head of the household, Mr. Despard, was having a relationship with another woman, and the woman was. It sounds a bit hard for me to imagine that this woman would be dressed in widow's weeds and would be making herself would be so indiscreet, as to sort of put herself on view for up to nearly half an hour to the members of the family.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the argument, Underwood's argument, and it came at a time when his relations with the SPR were at an all-time low, and Peter was one for blowing his own trumpet. He didn't like the. I got the impression that at times he did actually resent the SPR and their claims to, it was a bit of Ghost Club versus SPR, or Ghost Club Society versus SPR politics going on there. So I'm not sure we should take it entirely seriously, the mistress hypothesis. But Rosina Despard goes out of her way in the article, in the R.C. Morton article, as she did it in Proceedings 8, to say that there were proofs of immateriality. And the proofs she gives are that she stretched string across the staircase and the apparition passed through them, etc., etc. So she definitely rules it out. So his argument there is that he thinks the lady protests too much, that actually everybody in the family knew that he was. There are reasons why it's possible, but there are many more reasons arguing against it if you know the town and especially the social context of the time. Pittville was not an ordinary place. It was a place where you had to go through a morals commission to be allowed to purchase a house. there was a committee which ruled, which was based on the old committee which decided who would be allowed to attend balls and could purchase a ticket. There was a committee that checked if your house was of a suitable design. Your house servants had to walk along specially made alleyways that ran on the back of the houses and weren't allowed to walk on the avenues with the trees and had to be kept out of sight, and so on. I mean, it was a ridiculously snobby second town within the Chelt Valley. I think it's unlikely, is what I'd say.
I may have just a little correction. I may have made a mistake. You may have corrected me there. That the R.C. Morton article, was it in the proceedings of the SPR?
Yeah, it was Proceedings 8.
Right. I said the journal. I'm sorry about that. I'm glad you've put that right. Yes.
Technically, Myers had moved by that time to London. He was in London, but his mother lived in Keynsham Road, which is about half a mile away from there and from where I am now.
I maybe just explain to listeners that the difference between the proceedings and the journal, the journal of the SPR is a regular thing that comes out, supposed to come out four times a year. The proceedings is a more intermittent thing. If someone submits a large body of work that they deem worth publishing, an issue of the proceedings will come out. But I'm sorry, I accept that I was wrong there. That it's the proceedings.
No. In the 1980s, I joined the Society for Psychical Research, and I was sitting in Great Norwood Street in Cheltenham, reading an article, some of Myers' notes. And Myers mentions that he interviewed a maidservant on a certain date in Cheltenham in Great Norwood Street, and I was living in the house where he had interviewed her 100 years before.
Yes.
So it was just one of those coincidences, one of those moments when I realized that Myers and myself had sat in the same room, but he'd been interviewing a maidservant and I just happened to live in that room. Yeah. So it was quite a strange feeling, actually, because it was exactly 100 years. So, yeah, that was why we named the original Cheltenham Research Group the Myers Society. But anyway, that wasn't what I was going to talk about. There was one other thing I wanted to ask you about. The additive problem is, of course, that you would need people together for a sustained time, but it would mean that hotels or buildings with many occupants, like schools or Wembley Stadium, for example, would be far more haunted, one would assume, than somebody who lived alone. Because if it was a simple, but it's obviously not simply additive. D. Scott Rogo came up with various models like this, but the one I'm thinking of is, have you read Philip Eamon Isaac Bonewitz, PEI Bonewitz? I don't know if you've ever seen his stuff. He was the founder of I think it's called something like RNDA, Reformed RDNA, Reformed Druids of North America. He was an American occultist who in 1970 used elective courses to do the first BA in magic at the University of Southern California. Because if you were suitably qualified and you got a scholarship and were brilliant in many ways, you were allowed to put together your own course from the courses that were taught there. And he decided to study the history and practice of magic. And he dedicated a lot of his life to investigating if individuals could perform psychic feats or add to hauntings. And he did a book, 2 books. One of them is called Authentic Thaumaturgy and is about using historical magic in role-playing games. That's of no interest to anyone unless, like me, you design role-playing games. But the other one, Real Magic, is his attempt to discuss the occult and magic and spells in terms of how they would work if Psi was real, if ESP was real. And he hung out with Rogo and the others. And
I should say that, I mean, I gave a very simple model, and it was the 2 factors were, I used an additive relation, but as I say, I don't know whether I said actually, but I think the relation between the 2 factors could be in some cases even multiplicative. So, for instance, if you had a 2 for the propensity of the house to generate phenomena, a 3 for the individual score, if it's additive, that gives you 5, which is below the threshold. But if it's multiplicative, it's 6. So you're already into phenomena occurring. And fluctuating individual scores, not some constant sort of, you're not 6 all your life. So, and it may be that at certain intensities of the process, things can be exponential or something like that. So I imagine it's quite a complicated relation in reality.
I mean, Bonewitz's version, all he does that I thought you might find interesting was he postulated that some people, namely many people extraordinarily skeptic, have a negative effect.
Yeah.
So they would reduce the overall level of phenomena. So if you took them into a place that was 6, because they have a -3 or a -10 or whatever it may be, nothing happens while they're in the building.
I'm going to be a bit self-congratulatory here, because I've found in 2 or 3 of the cases I've looked at that my involvement in the case things seem to go quiet.
That's exactly what we found with Hugh Wake. Whenever we took my friend Hugh to a case, no matter how terrible the phenomena might be, and even if the rest of the team went into the building, on one occasion the toilet seat was banging up and down.
Yeah.
To this day, somewhere I've got a videotape of a toilet seat doing this. And I thought it was going to change the world. But as everyone said, Chris, it's a toilet seat banging up and down. It might be some kind of air block, or it might be fraud. But whatever it is, it just looks ridiculous. No one's going to believe that. But Pat Yates took the film. But when Hugh entered the building, stopped. Everything stopped. So we had what appeared to be active poltergeist activity while 4 of us were in the house, or 5 of us were in the house. But as soon as he entered, it stopped. And that was the case time and time again. There was another theory that he puts forward, is that some people actively generate a kind of random chaos that overwrites other people's, overwrites the psychic phenomena and redefines it. And that they basically rewrite the buildings they are around over a period of time. And he gave a couple of cases to example that. My favourite part of his theory, or some of the stuff that we came up with out of that, was the notion that people who are highly psychic in terms of doing Xenocard tests and who show ESP control seem to be negative to the chances of generating hauntings. So we wondered if actually hauntings are exacerbated by people who can't control their own psychic powers, that it's a kind of leakage of psychism, but with people who use them successfully to win the lottery or get a girlfriend or float spoons across the room or whatever, they actually don't add to the background haunting because they're actually processing and teleologically using it in a designed manner. But these are all very theoretical ideas that I'm just thinking about when you were talking. Fascinating idea, and one we must definitely explore. Fantastic. Maybe you could write it up for the journal.
Yeah.
That would be a good idea. I think we should publish that for the next journal, because I think that would make a really interesting paper. But then I'm very biased towards theories of ghosts. And finally, that's what I was going to say. Last thing, I promised I'll shut up. The SPR, my theory is that in 1888, William Barrett, who was actually the founder of the SPR, Sidgwick was then put in charge of it, and Barrett was the first president, and Barrett was quietly sort of moved to one side. And Stainton Moses and Barrett's friends all left. About 300 members walked out in 1888 because they felt the SPR had become this is the British SPR, because something similar happened in the American one as well. But they felt that the SPR had become a debunking organization. And the SPR was very, very skeptical of physical phenomena and physical mediumship, but they did believe in telepathy and the higher phenomena. And I personally believe that the artificial distinction between ghosts and poltergeists, or as me and Becky call them, polterwatsits, because we still don't think the term makes much sense, is actually entirely artificial and results out of ideological squabbles in the early SPR rather than any real evidence. Because most cases we have examined over our years, both of us over, in my case, 30 odd years in the field, have shown mixed physical and apparitional phenomena. So I think it's a false distinction. I think they lay on a spectrum, and that depending on which end of the spectrum you're looking at, the physical might be stressed or the apparitional might be stressed, but I don't think they're two separate phenomena. But I'll shut up now. And Christian, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think a lot of the questions, certainly the first portion here, kind of you all have just touched there in regards to, with your suggested model, Rob Gandy asks, do you record increased frequency but lowering intensity and vice versa? And I think you guys really just touched on that. Effectively, it's a fluctuating system. So Rob Gandy then goes on to ask, is that if you have many people with a low score, 1, and then 10 of them all get together at a party, does this then create a combined score of 10? Meaning do paranormal manifestations then break out? So would there be a collective increase? Would that be how you would describe your system?
Well, that hypothetical model was what I say. It was hypothetical. It was to illustrate how you could get interaction. And yes, in terms of that hypothetical model, as I laid it out, that would be the case. If you had 10 people with a personal score of 1, that would be 10, so you'd have phenomena. But in reality, of course, as I'm saying, there'll be all sorts of factors working one way or the other. And that may not be the case. One of the reasons that I quite like the hypothetical model was the fourth scenario, where it shows that the Kate arriving at Julie's premises, moving in, could trigger phenomena, even though Kate herself might be have less proclivity to generate paranormal phenomena than Julie herself, and people could therefore assume wrongly that Kate was wholly responsible, as it were, as it was the poltergeist focus. In other words, the notion of a poltergeist focus could be a slightly naive concept if you've got a complex interaction.
So you're saying that a poltergeist is a Gestalt, or I can't say it, but it's a compound entity. That's really interesting, and I like the idea that you've included the location, the physical, as well as the personalities. And what would be the factors that would lead to the score, though? Would it be?
What would be the factors that would lead? Sorry, to
make somebody a 5 or a 7 or a 10? What do you think would be? I mean, obviously their propensity to psychic experience, but then we have to look at what drives that. Is it genetic, or is it? We don't know, do we?
We don't know. Yes,
that's what we need to test, because to be able to test it, and we want to test it. That's the thing. It's a great idea. I think it's a brilliant idea. I just want to find a way of testing it, because that would be fun. That really would be great. We could take a bunch of people who are have reported repeated phenomena, take them to some of your window areas. What do you call them? Zones of strangeness. Yeah. And see if that actually provokes a reaction. But the problem is that because of priming, because of set and setting, it's almost certainly going to cause an imaginative one, even if not a real one. But then again, if something actually physical occurs, we could be there with equipment to monitor it.
I did do a little experiment some years ago, wrote it up in the Paranormal Review, got a group of people together to imagine UFO events occurring at a house. They were sent pictures of the house, and they were asked to kind of carry out a visualization ritual, I think for, a couple of times a night or something. I can't remember the details now, over, I think it was something like a 2-week period. And the question was whether this would result in the people at the house who gave permission for me to target them, as it were, or target their property, whether they would experience any. It seems that they didn't, but there were problems with the study. I mean, I don't know how much compliance there was with the request that people spend X amount of time on the visualization, but it did occur to me one could try experimental hauntings. Not just UFO phenomena, but you could try it. The only problem is that imagine the thing took off and took on a life of its own. Let's say someone kindly volunteered their property to be used as a target site for an experiment like that, and then it started happening, out of control. It could be rather disturbing. So. Maybe it's better to do it in a laboratory setting or something, and maybe, just in case, before doing something a little bit that could get out of control.
The early proceedings of the SPR are full of experimental projection by young men into the bedrooms of young Victorian ladies,
Yes.
which is completely unthinkable. But there are many examples of it, and I have actually been saying that we should try this, that this is the kind of experiment that we could probably find volunteers for, people trying to manifest to one another or to their friends. Experimental telepathic ghosts, but I haven't managed to get it together to work out any way of actually making that a sensible experiment. But I will think about that, and we shall try that together. We'll have a go at that. But for the moment, I'd just like to very much invite you to publish your theory and to any ramifications of that, because I think that's a fantastic, really interesting paper. So thank you very much indeed. Right,
Okay.
Christian, do we have any more?
I mean, generally speaking, I mean, like Kieran's a question here has got a lot of thumbs up. Really, you just articulated there very well, which is about how you would assign the scores used in the model. I think you've kind of roundabout kind of covered that as such, and that was repeated by a number of people about how you would assign those point systems to a case. Again, Kieran refers to a case of his own experiences, as does Kaz here as well, regarding phenomena happening in a house of physical poltergeist-like phenomena. In terms of any other questions, I haven't seen any others here as I scroll down, but I'm ultimately an interesting talk. Lots of thanks, and very, very interesting, because, of course, that can be adapted to so many potential cases that are active now, or retrospectively looking at any cases, then applying that system to them. And I'm basically creating a score map or a heat map of the activity that's happening there. I think that certainly needs to be applied to a number of cases that perhaps we all have on record, obviously within the ASSAP archives. So really good.
Steve Barrell mentioned psychoenergetics, which I think Manfred Cassira mentioned to me many years ago. I have never seen a single issue of that journal. I assumed that it was very much involved with the Owen group. Have you ever come across a copy of Psychoenergetics, Peter?
I don't know. It may be something I have, but I've forgotten about. I'm not sure.
Well, Steve says for 5 years, 1970s to the early 80s, there appeared a journal called Psychoenergetics that focused on PK and occasionally touched on the possibility of group minds creating objective phenomena. So it's the early days of the Toronto experiment. It's before the Toronto experiment, actually. But it would be post Kenneth Batcheldor's work on table tipping, where he came up with the notion that you could create an experimental haunting, which was used for conjuring up Philip by Owen. There's another fascinating bit in that book, actually. I read it recently, a couple of years ago, and there's an appendix at the back of Conjuring Up Philip where he comes to the same conclusion that Barry Colvin did about acoustics and poltergeists and the prolonged attack on the acoustic waveform. Exactly the same as the 2010 paper or 2009 paper by Barry Colvin. It's Appendix C of Conjuring Up Philip. So it's interesting they both came to the same conclusion 30 years apart. So anyway, thank you very much, Peter. And most people are just saying thank you, I think, as far as I can see. There's a police encounter with a violently slamming door at 9 minutes 40 seconds. We'll send these over to you so you can read through them all and respond, if you'd like to do that. Psychoenergetics. Tony Percy has found a copy. Tony, would you like to books Google? Well, it's in here. If anyone would like to keep a copy of the group meeting chat, I can email it to anyone. Write to me at chair@assap.ac.uk. But thank you very much to Peter for a truly fascinating, really interesting talk, and we look forward to having him back again soon. And I hope my questions weren't too wild, but I've been sitting here sort of thinking about things while you were talking, and this is very much my great love, as you know. So thank you very much indeed. What do you think would be the best neutral? I mean, I saw the Americans in the early 90s came up with a whole new set of terms to replace things like clairvoyance and ESP that were value neutral, theory neutral, and I thought they were much better in many ways, but I can't remember. Anomalous cognition, I think, was one of them instead of clairvoyance or telepathy, which is, just an idea coming to mind without you. So it's as opposed to, or anomalous movement, for example, rather than telekinetic psycho.
Stephen Browdy has written an article in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, maybe more than one article, criticizing the rush to new terminology. He gives examples where he thinks that some of the proposed new terminology is a backward step.
Yeah, absolutely. But lots of people saying a very interesting talk, says Julia Elizabeth Boyd. Thank you very much, says Kaz Kelsall. Edward says, excellent talk. Thank you, Peter, says Stu Neville. And so forth. Thought-provoking talk, says Ruth Morris. Very thought-provoking, says Jackie Tonks. Thank you, Peter. Very interesting, says Emma Harvey. Brian James says, very interesting talk. Thank you. Brilliant talk. Many thanks. Thank you. That was really interesting, says Ursula. Kieran, great talk, Peter. Thanks. And so on all the way up. So I won't read out the rest of it because there is no point. Send them to you and you can read them. But thank you very much. I think everybody was very, very pleased indeed.